What if your parents died tomorrow? Would you have felt that you had had all the conversations that you wanted to have before they left? Well, in the latest podcast with Kanyan, we talk about how he started a therapeutic process with his father after a near-death experience, and how that conversation has now led him to start a program called Parents Reimagined, where he offers services and podcasts and resources so that parents and children can come together and have hard conversations. Even if your parents are gone, there's a way that you can relate to them differently to change the way you relate to the world around you. We talk about this in our podcast, and it's so fascinating. I think I cry like 3 times on there. And let me know what you think. And thanks for watching and listening to the Re-Belle podcast. Khan.
Andres.
Why are we here?
I have no idea. Why are we here?
Why are we here? Let's start where you were born.
All right. I was born in Nanchang in China.
And you came over to the United States?
That's right. When I was 2.5 to Tennessee.
It seems like, from what I know of you, there's been a real desire to kind of get to the bottom of something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's your mind, your emotions, your body, like your relationship with spirit. There's been a lot of iterations.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how that started, why it started.
Yeah, I think that's inherent to my nature. I remember when I was in 5th grade or maybe 4th grade, or maybe even earlier, maybe it was 7th or 2nd or 3rd grade, I made a survey on a piece of paper and just asked, what is the meaning of life? And I'd bring it around to my little 2nd grade friends and be like, will you fill this out? And I remember actually I gave it to this one other girl and she said, why are you doing this? This is stupid. And I remember being so confused, like, what, you think this is stupid? This is the most important thing.
and then you read Hitchhiker's Guide and they boiled it down to the number 42 and you were like, this is bullshit.
I never read that, so maybe I should go check it out.
No. So did you get the answer?
I've got some working hypotheses.
Oh, yeah. So you embark on an early journey to explore the meaning of life.
Mm-hmm. Why are we here? Why am I here? And what do I do about it?
Yeah. It can be overwhelming, the uncertainty that's around us, I think, and how small we are.
I think the uncertainty can be really unnerving. Smallness can be really comforting, I find.
Yeah. Why?
Well, in a way, I think a lot of people have this relationship to spirit or God or something bigger, as there's a kind of dwarfing my own ego's importance in relationship to life. And there's something relaxing or surrendering about that. It's like, oh, it's maybe not all up to me. And I can just sort of surrender to something bigger than me and trust that how my ego feels about what happens to be going on in this moment is not that big of a deal.
I believe that on a certain level because I feel that, for example, in this moment, being present with you, that really nothing else matters aside from what is happening right now. And there's so many other things that are happening in the world and around us and whatnot, but the presence of this moment is essentially everything. And it's small, but it's everything. And yet, there is a part of me that's also aware that we're being filmed.
Oh.
With the idea that this could have resonance with others.
Uh-huh.
And so, how do we work with the nature of our smallness while also wanting to somehow impact others, knowing that, or not knowing, but sensing that maybe our impact can't be that large given that we're so small?
Oh.
That's how I think of it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm not sure I share the same tension around it. It's like I'm this little infinitely tiny being, a speck of dust in the geologic space of time and vastness. And my soul and my heart have longings, and those longings involve you, the people I love, this place. And both of those are happening at the same time. They're not in tension. Yeah.
So did those longings that you've now cultivated in your life, did they appear naturally, or were they cultivated?
Oh, both. Yeah, I think the longings come from such different places. I love the Jungian frame of how there's the oneness of spirit, and there's also an expression of that in this embodied being, which is my soul, and then there's also my ego, which is the construct of all the social forces from my upbringing. And I think spirit doesn't. Well, maybe I might say it wants awareness of itself, but my soul has its own agenda, its own purpose in this embodied being, and its own longings. And then my ego has all the longings that have been programmed into it and embedded into it. So, all of that is present right here. Yeah.
What are some keys to knowing that something is like something that is a longing for you? Like, how do you describe the feeling of a longing or some expression of the soul in that way?
Yeah. Well, for me, like you mentioned before, I'm a dancer, so the somatic felt body sensation experience is really at the fore of my experience of longing. And it often feels like, and it depends again on where it comes from. Like, it can come from different centers of my body and my awareness. Like, there's the longing of the heart and the feeling of a kind of a desire for connection that emerges forth and pulls me forward. It kind of magnetizes me. The love of transcendence, which comes from a really different place. It's maybe more up here and is about, seeking oneness. There's the visceral primal longing of sexuality and desiring of the carnal expression and of the flesh and kind of feeling into that in a deep way. There's the longing in the very root of me, just of a desire for safety and belonging and being of a place. So all these longings have different flavors and different textures. Yeah.
And then, because I think I identify with those same longings in the sense that they're more that I'm aware that those are almost like desires to move towards, with an awareness that there's aspects of me or my past that have blockages or not inabilities, but challenges to move fully and in flow to get to those points. So if it would be to groundedness and safety, or to transcendence, or for love and the longing for romantic love and closeness, or touch and sexual desire, all of those centers that you just mentioned, or longings, they come with a certain, some blockages. Mm-hmm. Is that part of what motivates you to then turn to different expressions within those longings? Like, to make the flow of those move more freely?
I think I understand your question. Your question is, or what I'm taking away, maybe, let me know if this is wrong, is how I meet blockages or resistances to those longings. Is that right?
Yeah, and also within that, do those blockages and resistances also motivate the choices you make in terms of what you're choosing to do within those worlds, like in terms of their expressions. Like if you know, yeah, I guess I'm wondering if the blockages arise first and then you meet them and seek to repair them or move through them.
Yeah.
Or yeah, maybe I think what you were going for made sense, but there's some nuance that I'm missing, I think, about where the longing arises.
Right.
Because for me, sometimes I become aware of my longing also in relationship to the blockages that I have within those realms.
What's an example? Then I'll
Yeah.
clarify.
Okay. I think that I can move freely in a dance environment when I'm by myself. And I'm aware that when you add other people to the mix in a dance environment, I struggle to feel the connection with myself. And so I think that's more of like a relational thing, but it makes me think that dance is a great avenue for me to explore how I can move through the energy of my challenges in connecting with others. So then I delve deeper into dance as a way to also remove the resistance and the blockages that I perceive within me.
Yeah. So you're asking me whether the place where I experience obstacles is also drawing me in for my own development.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I really identify with that. I love Marcus Aurelius's quote, which I'm paraphrasing as "What's in the way is the way."
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think I've taken that so to heart that I identify as kind of counterphobic. Like when I'm afraid of something, I'm fascinated by that, and I love to go explore it and be closer to it.
Yeah.
And I think that gets to what you're talking about, like, oh, why am I so bothered by this? And that's to me like such an invitation if one is on a developmental journey, a psycho-spiritual journey of integration, of wholeness. It's like all the things that are loudly pronouncing we're not okay is an invitation to integrate and retrieve and make whole.
Yeah, that resonates with me for sure. Because, just any time that I feel uncomfortable, discomfort's a great teacher for me. Because rather than, well, I try most of the time, although I don't fully succeed, rather than just stay in the discomfort, I get curious about it. I'm like, well, why am I having this resistance here? And then it can serve as like such a great tool for a deeper understanding, and then eventually not necessarily removing the discomfort, but tolerating it more, certainly, to allow for more, I think, connection and closeness.
Maybe an anecdote and then a kind of curiosity, which is last year I spent most of the year volunteering as a hospital chaplain. And I would just go room to room on the oncology floor, knock on the door and say, "Hi, I'm Con, the chaplain here at the hospital, checking in to see if it would feel good to chat." And maybe most people would say no. And some people would say no pretty harshly. They'd set a strong boundary. And I remember when I first started, it was so hard just to knock on that door and walk in, knowing this is such like an intimate, delicate place for somebody and that they would likely not want me there.
Right.
And it was such a lesson in rejection. And now that a year has passed and I've just knocked on, hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000 doors, I feel so grateful for that lesson in rejection. And I wish I had learned it earlier in my life. And some part of me wants like everybody to go get an experience doing like door-to-door sales or something, because I think our ego and my ego is so afraid of rejection. And yet it's something that's so, having become intimate with it, it's like a freedom to not worry about being rejected. It's like, well, yeah, that might happen, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I identify with that. I had that experience when I started an acting career, and I was getting rejected left and right. Like, and at first, the fear of that rejection, well, not only did it prevent me from putting myself up for certain roles, but on top of that, I would go into roles already with the either the idea that I was gonna get rejected or the fear of not the fear, but the yeah, like wanting to avoid the pain of that rejection. And so then I would talk myself out of how important this opportunity was.
Yeah.
And maybe I would show up a little bit less prepared, potentially in anticipation of the rejection.
Yeah.
And then finally I was rejected so much. And it would take me at first a significant amount of time to recover from it. I would take days sometimes. And then it was like the recoveries turned into one day, half a day, couple hours. And then I was like, oh, this is okay. It's just like a part of life. And it's not that they're rejecting me and my soul and my little baby boy, Andy, who's down there looking for acceptance. It's just they are looking for something else. And that was pretty liberating for me, too.
Yeah. And there's something so beautiful and elegant that these things that I'm so resistant to experiencing tend to be liberatory to receive. And it's like some sort of weird puzzle that the ego is set up that way. That's like, what I don't want is the key.
Oh, yeah. Today is my 3-year anniversary of the drugging and robbing that happened to me in Colombia. I certainly didn't want that. It wasn't, I mean, that wasn't, maybe it was my ego wanted it. In some ways I did choose it. Anyway, it was what I needed to push through my over-identification with money and some of the self-worth issues I had built and still have, but not as strongly around the need for the validation from women or also my tendency to numb when difficult emotions come up. Those were 3 worlds that I really needed to look at that all came out as a result of a near-death experience.
Yeah.
And yeah, I honor those moments in life, and if it's our ego or whatever creates those conditions for them to exist so that we can, I guess that's the question, so that we can what?
Yeah, and to me, it's so we can be in our evolution. And that's one thing I love that I think Jung said, which is that ego defeat, being utterly defeated in terms of what our ego wants, is a necessary precondition to any kind of developmental leap. Like we can kind of make gradual kind of shifts, but to leap requires some sort of full surrendering into defeat. The thing that I wanted is fully taken away from me.
Let's talk a little bit about what inspired you to go into a therapeutic process with your father. And then we'll use that to get into the work that you're doing, if you're open to it.
Yeah, totally. I was terrified of my dad my whole life. And part of that is from corporal punishment. And part of that's that he had a temper when he was a young man. And so my body just learned to associate his anger and temper with danger. And so I did disassociate. And oftentimes if I was just with him, I couldn't escape. I couldn't get anywhere. And so I just learned to energetically leave, essentially.
Do you have an example of something that happened when you were a kid that you were like, that was like so unpredictable, it like knocked you?
Yeah, I have lots of distinct memories, and they all come together. Like none is like a huge one, but I remember like one time we got our first family PC, our first computer, and I was just playing with it because I was like, oh, this is novel. Like I can move things around on the screen. Like, wow, it's kind of like a video game. And I remember I was encouraged to like play with it. It's like, oh, okay, I'll play with it. And I just like put all the stuff in the trash can because I was like, oh, that does something. It makes the trash can look full. Like, that's kind of neat. And I emptied the trash can. And then later my dad came and was like, you deleted all the files. And I was like, what does that mean? And I remember I got punished and had to get spanked and yelled at. And I was like, I was encouraged to do this, play with this thing. You didn't tell me what not to do or to do. And like, I'm getting punished for it now and being physically hurt. Like, and there's lots of like little moments of just like the unfairness in relationship of power of like a child to a parent who's like a godlike figure to somebody so small. And that combined with violence and pain just like created this kind of total helplessness of like, I'm just going to energetically leave and disconnect from my body because it's not safe here. So yeah, that was at the core of it. And I didn't even realize that, for children, it's just like the water we swim in is reality. So I didn't think that was wrong or right or good or bad. I was like, oh, this is just what it is. And I'm not sure I even knew I was disassociating. I certainly didn't have that word until well into adulthood. But when I was in college, my dad had a medical emergency. I got a voicemail from my mom, and I had to drive home in the middle of the night from Austin to College Station where they lived. And I went straight to the hospital at dawn. I remember walked in there and I saw my dad in this hospital bed. And I just have this distinct memory of the light being kind of like cobalt at dawn. And I walked to that bed and just started crying because I saw my dad and I had never seen him as weak or frail before. And he looked so weak and so frail, and we didn't know whether he was going to live or die. And so in that moment, I remember thinking, well, this could be my last time being with this man who I love, despite being terrified of who I loved. And I remember giving him a long hug, and I don't think we'd had a long hug in many years. By then I was around 20 probably, and just cried and felt connected to him. And that feels like a major turning point somehow in my relationship to him, of some sort of like unconscious, like not even thinking that much about him, to having some sort of reflective awareness of impermanence. I think something about death and impermanence forces awareness and consciousness to the fore.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so being with his mortality, somehow it was brought more to my attention that, oh, there's some things that aren't quite right here in this relationship. And I couldn't even put that into words at the time, but it was just a felt sense of like, oh, there's like a tightness around this person when I'm with them, especially if they get angry or they're tight. And what's so, what's the right word? It's so insidious about that pattern in particular, the leaving, the disassociation, is it's almost like, because it's a numbing, there can be, for me, there was like not even an awareness that anything was happening. It's almost like a little blank emerged in that time in my sense of the narrative of life. It would just be a dull spot. Even while I was in it, I wouldn't be able to think, oh, something's wrong. It's almost like no thoughts would be happening. And so it kind of occluded itself for most of my life. And it wasn't until I got deeper into meditative practice, inner awareness, somatics, that I even began to have distinctions in my experience of being me that told me something about this experience that was like, oh, there's numbness happening right now. That's interesting. Or, oh, my chest is tight. I think I'm afraid of this person. Like, I'm not even sure I would even have the words to have known that I was afraid. It was something much like number and in a fog.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost took a kind of like developmental expansion of capacity of awareness to even decipher these little signals that were in the fog, to be like, oh, I'm terrified.
Mm.
Yeah.
You developed this awareness of that space that was blank and missing, and there's a desire in you to go and fill the void.
Is it filling the void? That's a way of saying it. To me, it was something like there was something there that was stuck.
Okay.
And it needed to be cleared. And I didn't even know what it was.
Uh-huh.
And I would try to have this conversation with my dad sometimes when when I was home, because by then I wasn't living there. And every time I tried, I would disassociate. And so I couldn't, like, the mind would literally slow down so much where I would just not even know, like, what was I talking about? Like, it would just become hard to continue. And so I would just disconnect and wander off. And it took a lot of capacity building and skill building from so many different things that enabled me to finally have the conversation. And it feels like a real miracle to me that I did, because it was so hard. And I tried several times over many years. And ultimately, like, I remember I had a psychedelic experience, and that's what catalyzed I got a phone call from a person who was close to me, who I was seeing at the time, who had a mentor. And she said, "Oh, my mentor is going to call you." I said, "No, okay." And I had just woken up, and I was still in this psychedelic journey. I actually did it the night before, and I woke up in this kind of recurrence of it. I woke up fully with the medicine, and shortly after, I got a call from this number, and I pick up the phone, and the voice says, "Where do you need a breakthrough in your life?" And I remembered, oh, this person's mentor is calling me. I said, "Oh, is this," I forget his name. I said, "Is this Peter?" And he said, "Yes. Where do you need a breakthrough in your life?"
Just like that.
Just like that.
Holy shit.
And I said, I think I'm pretty good. I'm pretty happy with my life. And he said, "So you're completely clear and complete with your mother and your father?" And I thought for a moment. I thought, "Oh, no, I'm not. Thank you. I know what I need to do." And he said, "Okay." Hung up the phone, sent my dad a voice memo and said, "Hey, Dad, I need to have a conversation with you where I'd like to share with you everything I've never shared with you, that I'm angry, sad, and resentful about my childhood. And I want you to just listen to it and not respond and repeat it back to me. Would you be willing to do that?" And a few seconds later, he listened to it and responded in text and said, "Yeah, I would do that for you. I love you." And I just started crying.
It's making me cry.
Yeah. Because I didn't even think to ask anything of my dad. So I really didn't know anything about what his capacity was. And we'll talk about this later when I talk about my project, but I think for a lot of people, what's available on the other side, we don't even know. I didn't know. And later that day, I had a 90-minute Zoom call with my dad, and I shared all this stuff and just cried, sobbed the whole time, and shared literally every single memory I've never told him. And he listened to all of it. And some of the most memorable, beautiful things was, I remember I was sharing one memory, and he said, "I don't remember that happening." And I said, "Dad, I'm not saying that it happened. I'm saying that I remember it. And those are two different things." And to his credit, which I think is, he's a remarkable human being, and his response to this really illustrates that. He said, "Huh, yeah, I guess what you remember is what really matters anyway, more than whether it happened or not." And I just felt such a relief when he said that. And yeah, it was such a gift, kind of an expression of love. It was like an abdication of who's right or wrong, and just, I love you, and if you remember something that's painful for you, that matters to me.
Right. And it's really a loving, and it's loving, and it also just really, like, lets you be seen.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I don't even know whether it happened or not. I have a memory of it. That's as much as I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had that conversation, and we had a few other big clearings. This was probably 5 years ago now. And in a way that felt like one of the biggest, most important conversations of my life. And yet our dynamic, our way of relating to each other would just regress back to the old one, which was not talking that much. When we did talk, it's kind of surfacey stuff. And then maybe once in a while, we'd have a deep intellectual conversation. That's kind of the modality that we interacted in. And it didn't feel satisfactory to me. Like I had a longing, speaking of longings, I had a longing for more depth and connection with my father. And this thing around being triggered by him was not alleviated by him. Like the leaving that I would do when he would get angry, it would still happen to me, even though we'd had this big conversation. And 2 Christmases ago, I was home visiting them. And this is another great example of how ego defeat and what we don't really want is exactly the developmental invitation. I had just gotten out of a relationship that was hard for me in many ways, but one thing I learned from it so beautifully was about boundaries and how clueless I was about boundaries and intimate relationships, and how I just had this blind spot. Like I didn't even know to set a boundary. It wasn't like I had trouble setting it. It was like I didn't even have the thought to set it.
Yeah, I get that.
And I learned, I was forced to learn it in this relationship because it was challenging for me. And I just gotten out of it, and I was home for the holidays. And my dad got really angry and yelled while we were having dinner, and I disassociated. But in that moment, unlike all the other past times this had happened, my new neural pathway for relating to that was, oh, I'm disassociated. Oh, that means I need to set a boundary. And so in that moment, I disrupted the pattern and just started talking about that with my parents. And it was like somebody had like pulled the pin off the record or scratched the record that had been running for, 30 something years or longer for them. And they kind of looked at me like, what? Like, it's so disorienting when somebody disrupts a pattern that long lasting.
So you did it by saying like, hey, right now I'm disassociating, something's wrong, let's talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And they were like, what?
It's like, we're busy running the same script we've been running for 40 something years. Like, what are you doing? Yeah, and so I had a conversation later with my dad once I settled down, and I was like, hey man, like, I love you. I love you a lot, and I want to have a deep, beautiful relationship with you. And I would love to have a family someday and have you be a part of that in a deep, integrated way. And if it's going to be like this for me, where I'm feeling this way with you, I don't want to be around you. And it's not like judging you or making you wrong. It's just an assessment of my own state of being. So I want to have a connection. And so we're going to have to figure something else out if that's what you want too. And he said, well, I don't really know what to do about that. So do you have any ideas? And I said, well, to start with, you can come to therapy with me, my therapist. And he said, well, he's kind of resistant, and said, well, I'm not sure about that, but if that's what you need, then I love you and I want to support you. So yeah, I'll show up.
Wow. Oh, insane to have a father. It's just, the longing for that is so high inside of me, and yet it just seems so unlikely that my parents, and I know a lot of folks listening, would have their parents like take that step with their child. It's really, I don't know, it feels like it's so courageous of both of you, but like I feel like most kids and most adults like our age and in our early 40s we're trying to just figuring out on our own and like reparent ourselves. That's like the best I think that people have seen as being possible.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of that. And there's more, and there's also a fair amount, some at least, of people doing it with their parents. And one thing that's true for me, I'll speak just for myself, is that I think that being able to have the clearing like I did with my dad accelerated my capacity to reparent myself and be with myself. And I see this a lot in the interviews that I do, is there's it's almost like a law. There's a symmetry between the level of stuckness or clarity in that parental relationship and the stuckness and clarity within one's self and one's relationship between one's higher self and all these parts. And it can actually move either way. If you clear one up, the symmetry clears the other up. And for some people, it's like, oh, I can really do a lot of this work here, accepting myself, loving myself enough, and then I have less charge with the parent. But I think it can also work the other way. Like for me and my dad, like really clearing things up with my dad fundamentally cleared things up inside me. And I remember after I had that first conversation with him, cried 90 minutes, I got off that call and I remember like, oh, for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of my dad in the way I have been my whole life. Or at least it's gone down like 90% or something, other than those moments of trigger when he's angry. But what was fascinating was like, in that same moment, I had this realization of like, oh, and I didn't even notice this, but it's like, if that was a big wall between me and him, I realized there was a little wall between me and everybody. And something about like dismantling the big wall also dismantled the small wall. And it was like, I was 10% afraid of everybody. And suddenly that went away. I interviewed one guy and he told me he spent like 3 months focused on working on his relationship with his mom, who he judged as a narcissist, didn't like at all, like whole confrontational thing, conflictual thing. And by the end of it, when they got through to the other side, he said that 95% of his inner critic vanished.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, because I think therapy currently gives us the ability to almost use our parents as objects, and then we hold on to those objects and we allow those objects to then to understand them, to integrate them, and to have a conversation with those objects that already exist inside of us. But there is no, we're not actually with our parents in that room, and we've sort of like just, we just sort of have made assumptions about who they are. We've let them sit in our brain, and we use them in like a conversation.
Yeah.
In therapy.
Yeah.
And I think, okay, so in this case, you've brought your father into the therapy room with you.
Yeah.
And this started a year ago?
A year ago, yeah.
And you've had how many sessions together?
50 something at least.
And what would you say, so I don't even know where, tell me a little bit of some of the highlights of that.
Well, I love what you said about how it normally goes in the individual therapy about this object, because I think that's a big piece of it. It can be so useful to have the story of my parent as a thing to use as a mirror to like work on my material. But that's a story about them. And, it can be so powerful to transcend the story. And that's what I learned a lot in therapy, is seeing past the story of my dad as the person who was this for me as a kid, who behaved this way toward me as a kid. And very quickly, once we got into the therapy room, it started off with like venting some of the same stuff I vented before, but then we'd get into like exploring what was going on for my dad. I remember the therapist one day was early on, I was like sharing about being afraid of him, some story of how I was afraid of him. And my therapist asked my dad, like, well, how about you, Ben? Like, did you feel afraid of your dad when you were a kid? And my dad sat back and he thought about it for a minute. I'll never forget this. He said, well, it was a little different where I grew up. We were just afraid all the time. It was really an exception to not be afraid, because it was so terrifying to be there and to know that my dad grew up through the Cultural Revolution in China, and his mother was detained, jailed like 3 times. And anytime, you were at risk of death and your family's death at all times, essentially. And so he said, the question doesn't make that much sense, because I was just afraid 24/7. And I was like, as that landed in me, something like broke in my story about my dad. It was like, oh, like, you're so much more than the story of the guy who did this to me. And I kind of knew that at a conceptual level, but something in that moment like broke in me, and I was like, I don't even have to forgive you. Like, there's nothing to forgive. You did great. Like, given the circumstances you lived through, it's a miracle that you turned out as well as you did, and you parented me as well as you did. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that resonates. That really resonates. Yeah, and it's, you know what's scary is the idea that you might, like, there's a part of me that understands that I've othered, for example, my mother so much that in therapy and whatnot, that that I've unfairly treated her in my mind in a way. But there is a fear that if I let go
Yeah,
of the
totally.
of the image that I have of her, and I really then step into this place of compassion, what then will I use?
Yeah, totally. I hear that not infrequently from people I interview about this. And what's fascinating about that is, fascinating to me, is it seems one would think like, oh, that's something about how I relate to her, and I need to like come to some place of forgiveness or something so I can let this go. But the more people I talk to about this, they're able to move through what you're talking about, say that it usually took forgiving something in themselves and accepting themselves in a deeper way. And when they could get there, there's usually something that I'm judging in myself that holds together the need to judge my parent in this way. And if that inner judgment dissolves, then whatever is underneath needing to like relate to another, my mom, as wrong, as bad, dissolves at the same time. It's like that symmetry thing.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. So where are you with your father right now?
Well, let's see. Well, I'll answer that by sharing something on the way to answering that, which is that one thing that was really powerful about doing the therapy that I'm proud of and intuitively made sense to me was that we'd have these big clearing conversations for the past few years, but we'd go back into the way we related, like I said. And I realized we needed something that was like longitudinal and repetitive and ritualistic to shift such a long-standing 40-year pattern of how we related to each other. And it took so much effort, emotional labor, to do that in any given conversation. And that was the beauty of therapy. It forced us into a weekly hour container where we did things that were different than we normally did together. And in a way, that was enough. And like oftentimes my therapist doesn't say too much during the sessions. She might just say something like, well, what's it like for you to hear that? How about you? And sometimes that's enough. I would say most of the time that's enough, just at least for us and where we're at in our development. Just having a container, which includes a person to hold us accountable to having a different conversation every week, has shifted the texture of our relationship in a way that having big clearing catharsis did not. And so when you ask what's it like now, it's like there's more freedom to exit those deep grooves of habit. And so, for example, when I was back home over the holidays this time, again, my dad got mad. Again, I got triggered. But instead of doing the thing where I'm just wandering off disassociated, we're processing it. We're processing it as a family. We're having the conversation. It's not fantasy perfect. We're happy all the time, but it's like the silence I had around this is gone.
Wow. Yeah, there's a part of me that says this isn't possible. Like the thought of proposing therapy to my mom and dad would just be thrown out the window immediately. Mm-hmm. So what do you like? Talk to me a little bit about what you're working and building, and maybe answer that question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, maybe before I do that, just a quick question for you. You mentioned your journey with rejection. What's the impact of your mom or dad rejecting you when you ask them to go to therapy?
It's defeatist. It's like I accept their utter rejection of it without really pushing back too much. Because I feel like if I push, I'm going to have them go into their corner even more. So I'm left with just like, well, I mean, That's just what it is.
And if they go into their corner, that's a disconnection. And so you're feeling an aversion to the disconnection that will emerge. Is that right?
It's an aversion to the disconnection. And then there's another part that's on top of it, which is like, yeah, I perceive that they see me as this like hippie, woo-woo, like therapy boy.
Mm-hmm.
And they are like from a generation and a culture that's not where, where they come from. And so I those are the words that they won't say those words exactly, but there is sort of like a separation that exists in that moment when we talk about therapy. And I haven't really ever talked about the idea of going to therapy together, which is even another bold, crazy idea, but I like it. It's just bold. But I already buy into the structure to the perceived system that they come from a culture and they're a generation where they don't talk about things like that. And our generation is too much about the pursuit of this like happiness and this like these emotions that are just like not worthy of actually even going after. That they're kind of they're worthless pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that is their perspective. And I don't, I accept that is their view. And I guess I live with the fact that I just have to accept that that's the way that they see the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a kind of defeatism at a couple levels. There's like one, the aversion to the disconnection that you anticipate. And the other is like, I imagine it's like an aversion to just facing their worldview and how it might kind of threaten your own worldview in some way?
Yeah, because so much of my life is about like pursuing joy and happiness and getting to the bottom of things and feeling my emotions and like, I don't know, maybe there is a part of me that has some insecurity around the way that I've chosen to live my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's rich. There's a lot there. I'm trying to think where I want to enter. Gosh, there's so much.
I was going to, you could use me as an example, but I think generally you're building out a program to facilitate these more beautiful and deeper relationships with people's parents and their children. And it seems to me that one of the biggest pushbacks that you might get will be whatever excuse the child gives of, well, my parents won't do this.
Totally.
So I guess within that context of what you're doing, maybe it makes sense to talk about it.
Sure. So a couple ways I think about that. One is to totally acknowledge that there are some parents where there's probably nothing that the adult child can do. Maybe from just like a mental capacity perspective, or, there may be, and that could look like a lot of things. It could be mental health related to trauma, related to developmental gaps. And sometimes it's more painful than the adult child has capacity for to be with offering bids of connection to the parents and having them react in ways that are so painful for the adult child. That's true. And I think there's a lot of people, myself included, who maybe think that's true, but have actually not tried as much as we could try to actually ascertain what is possible. And so part of what I'm offering is a way to figure that out. Like, and assuming, the people that want to do this work, they already have some motivation. And the idea is to give them some tools to maybe even figure out more of what is possible with this other person. And for some people, like the people that, there's not much capacity or will from the parent, it might just be like an inner journey for the adult child. It could be a journey of grief and acceptance. And I hear that a lot, and a lot of beauty emerges from that. And sometimes what's miraculous is that just doing that work and assuming that nothing is going to happen over there results in a change over there. Because that's another symmetry, is that like the dynamic is often, I'm hesitant to say always, but it seems like a relational dynamic is co-created between two people. And if I fundamentally change over here, it can't run the same pattern, even if that person is so diminished in terms of their capacity. And I've heard this story from one woman I interviewed this past week who just said, yeah, I just really learned to love myself. And I stopped asking my mom to be any different way. And I just, from that place, re-engaged her. And she immediately noticed and asked me, like, what changed in you? And she started to soften toward me. So in a way, there's something mysterious and magical where possibilities can exist where we think they don't exist. And I'm not saying that they always will, but I'm saying that there's a lot of margin where what we think can't change could change.
Yeah, I believe that. I think we often like put ourselves in little holes of understanding to soothe ourselves and potentially avoid some of the discomfort of the truth, which is that maybe the reality is that it's more complicated than the simple way that we've liked to assume that our parents will behave and be.
Yeah. And that the story of them becomes so solid. And I hear this story too, which is a lot of times we talked about death. It is the specter of death that catalyzes the change. And a thing that was intractable and stuck our entire life. I have one friend who told me that this happened to him in his 50s, maybe even 60s, when his dad was dying in his 80s, is they never addressed their relationship. And when he started dying, they started talking.
Right.
It took them 50, 60 something years to get to that place. And yet it happened.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's also, I've been noticing it in my own relationships with my parents, is that the thing that the parent has represented for me in therapy or, that I use as an object in some way, it also needs the shift because, believe it or not, they are shifting and changing beings too. And I think I've been slightly unfair in my image of them because I've held them kind of like stuck in time.
Yeah.
And that's not really fair because there's so much wisdom in older people because they've lived life and they have so much to teach us. And of course, they have all the mechanisms and tools in place to be able to grow and evolve. And they've been doing it, maybe at a different pace or maybe with different tools. But I think it's important for me to remember, my mom and dad are shifting, growing beings. Yeah. And I want to allow for that.
Yeah. I love that attitude. One thing that reminds me of that's a big part of how I'm thinking about this work is that oftentimes when an adult child thinks about shifting the dynamics with their parents, it comes from a childlike place. It comes from a fantasy of the unmet needs. Like, finally, my dad will see me, and finally my mom will offer me the care that I didn't have my whole life. That's never going to happen. Well, let's put it this way. That might happen, but if that's like the fantasy of the shift, like it's very unlikely that that's the shift that's going to happen. More so, what I'm proposing is that oftentimes there's a kind of a stuckness in the relational dynamic, to your point. Like, I'm holding this person the way I held them when I was 16, and that's how I see them. And they see me as though I'm 16. Right. And so we're in this kind of energetic stuckness where we're not acknowledging the fact that our stories about each other are super aged compared to where we are today. And so the work, from my perspective, is actually just like updating our stories about each other, and not just about each other, but with each other. So there's like our relationship can have an awareness of our relationship. And when that's true, when that's unstuck, the relationship will organically and naturally become the relationship it wants to be. And that may be different. That's probably different than the fantasy of what I want it to be. But it's what already exists there. We talked about soul earlier, and the soul already has an agenda. It has what it wants to become. And the relationship has its own soul. It has its own agenda for what it wants to become. And if we unblock, then just like you're becoming the person you're becoming, the relationship can become the relationship it wants to become. And that may not, like I said, that's not necessarily the fantasy I have, but it's beautiful in and of itself.
It really is.
Because the fantasy is an ego fantasy. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really beautiful.
Yeah. I'll give you an example of me and my mom. So I've invited my mom to therapy. She's come twice. She doesn't want to come in anymore. And our second session, I said, well, Mom, I'd really love to know you in a deeper way and have access to more of your vulnerability. And I never hear you talking about anything hard for you or difficult. And she said, well, I don't want to talk about that. I don't like to think about that.
Well, my mom would say that too.
Yeah. And I think I knew that in some way, but something about her articulating it in this intentional space where we're examining and creating awareness of our relationship by our relationship, I had this image of like a wall that emerged between us. But before that, there was just like a kind of a fog. There was like, oh, I don't know why we're not closer, but we're not, and there's like a fog there. And instead of a fog, there's a wall. And the wall has texture, and I can press up against it and know what it is. And then I can talk about it. And that in and of itself, in a way, is the relationship gaining clarity about the relationship and allowing its evolution between us. And now we can even talk about that. I can tell a joke about that. It's like, it's not what I wanted. It's not my fantasy, but it's the relationship becoming itself, evolving into itself, unstuck.
Yeah, that is an example of how, the fantasy of all of a sudden your mom and you engaging in super vulnerable conversations isn't going to come into fruition necessarily. But what is now you have clarity in the space of what is in the space that you often assume exists now has clarity. And that matters for the relationship to be able to move forward in the place of the realm of what is, not in the imagination realm.
Yes. It has clarity and it has meta-awareness. And because it can continue having meta-awareness, it can continue becoming what it wants to be without getting stuck in my little story about it right now or back then. We can continually reference what it is right now and what it's becoming.
Interesting. So what is the program as it currently looks like?
So it's called Parents Reimagined, and it's starting off by creating a podcast. And the podcast, I just recently came to calling it a podcast. Before I was calling it a library of stories. And my vision for that was, until I met a Chinese heritage person that was in family therapy, that thought had literally never crossed my mind. I knew family therapy was a thing. It had never crossed my mind to invite a parent of mine to therapy. As soon as I met that person, I knew I could do it.
Oh.
And so the Library of Stories, the podcast, is a repository of possibility so that a person from any background, any context, whether it's a heritage, a race, a religious context, sexuality, gender, whether there was incarceration in the family, whether there was addiction in the family, whatever the circumstance, you can go on there and find stories that are related to your experience and hear what is possible from people that have walked that path and created some change for themselves and their parents. And so, that's the vision in it. It feels so dear to me. I feel so lit up and so on purpose because it made such a big difference to me. Yeah. And in addition to the podcast, I'm going to create a series of programs and workshops that'll help people kind of, depending on where they are in their own assessment of their parents' capacity and will, help them move forward their relationships. So yeah, that's where the program is today.
Wow, it feels so, when you hear something for the first time and you're like, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for you. It makes a lot of sense for the world that we're in. And it makes so much sense for bridging this gap, I think, also that our society needs in terms of reintegrating that generation. And like, I feel like such deep pain just societally, at least in the United States, how we treat the elderly.
Yeah.
And there's something about this that I feel like really cuts at the othering that we do towards old people. And in this relationship with our parents, I mean, it happens on the individual level, right? But it has this ability for us to kind of come back into contact with all the wisdom that's there.
I love that. And that gets back to the symmetry thing. When we alienate them, we alienate something in ourselves. And I did an interview with somebody today who told me that, oh yeah, my mom is like the bottom of the pyramid for me. And it was cracked and rotting. And when I cleaned it up and repaired it, I just feel more solid in who I am in my life, in my other relationships. And so, yeah, there's something about doing this work that is so core to each of us individually and our constellations collectively.
I love that.
What are you taking away from our conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I was really touched by the will that you kind of expressed that your father had for being able to engage with you. And it gives me a certain amount of hope and desire to do something. I mean, I don't know where will and capacity lands in my own parents and in my relationship with my parents. But I certainly feel this. I do long to stay in connection with them. And I also feel the same tension around having a family. And I feel like in the current dynamic, I would have to have some serious boundaries in terms of how they would interact with my children. And I would want my children to come in contact with my parents because they were awesome and great and loving parents. And I would like to figure out a way to not be so much on the defensive in the next phase of my life, should it come with a family.
Yeah. I love that that's your takeaway, and that brings up something that I do want to say that it reminded me of, which is that it's so hard to make a shift like this. Just the level of emotional labor required because of all that history, it's exponentially harder than shifting it with a friend or a colleague or somebody you just met. Like, it's so much harder. There's so much friction. What makes it a lot easier is having other people outside of the constellation. And that's why therapy is helpful. It doesn't have to be therapy. If you have a family friend that's willing to sit in with you and just have these conversations, that's huge. I was in a men's group for a while where we did a lot of focus on family stuff and just having that support and accountability group. And that's part of the design of the programs I'm working on, is having pods for accountability and support. There's something about having other people that diminishes the difficulty. And it's hard to explain, but it's something about, like, when we're just in these old constellations, the habit energy is so strong. When someone else is present, it tends to loosen that habit energy. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. You can't run the same program if there's other people around too.
And that's intuitive, right? Like, everybody has to behave. If I'm bringing home a date for the holidays, they can't just be their annoying selves.
I think another takeaway is just how, I guess I'm proud of you. I don't know why that's tender for me to say, but I am really proud of you. I see you following your path and what's alive inside of you. And that touches me. And it feels important. And it feels like it's connected to your heart. And it feels so good to see that in you. And it touches me being your friend and seeing you do that.
Oh, thanks for seeing me in that way. It's really nourishing for me. Yeah, I love you.
I love you too.
Wait, I didn't trust that you received my I love you.
Sorry, I suck at receiving.
Let's try again.
Okay.
I love you.
I love you too. I do. And I can receive your love too. Even it's hard, but I can receive it. I know you have it. So I'd like to end these conversations with a question that you would ask someone else to ask themselves if they're, well, could be that if they're watching this, or if it's a question that you wish more people would ask themselves. It could be related to your work, or it could not be.
Yeah. Am I completely clear and complete with my mother and my father?
Am I completely clear
And complete.
and complete with my father and mother?
If they dropped dead today, would we be good? There's nothing that I need to let them know that they might not know. There's nothing lingering, unfinished business that we need to clear up between us.
Great. Thanks, Con.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh.